Welcome to episode 54 of Lucretius Today. I am your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who's not familiar with our podcast, please check back to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any questions about that, please be sure to contact us at EpicureanFriends.com for more information. In today's podcast, we discuss one of the most important sections of the entire poem, the section in Book 4 that discusses how reason is dependent upon the senses. Let's join today's discussion with Charles reading the text.
Lastly, if anyone thinks that he knows nothing, he cannot be sure that he knows this when he confesses that he knows nothing at all. I shall avoid disputing with such a trifler, who perverts all things, and like a tumbler with his head prone to the earth, can go no otherwise than backwards. And yet, allow that he knows this, I would ask, since he had nothing before to lead him into such a knowledge, whence he had the notion what it was to know or not to know, what it was that gave him an idea of truth or falsehood, and what taught him to distinguish between doubt and certainty. But you will find that knowledge of truth is originally derived from the senses, nor can the senses be contradicted, for whatever is able by the evidence of an opposite truth to convince the senses of falsehood must be something of greater certainty than they. But what can deserve greater credit than the senses require from us, while reason, derived from erring sense, claim the privilege to contradict it? Reason, that depends wholly upon the senses, which unless you allow to be true, all reason must be false. Can the ears correct the eyes, or the touch the ears? Or will taste confute the touch? Or shall the nose or eyes convince the rest? This, I think, cannot be, for every sense has a separate faculty of its own. Each has its distinct powers, and therefore an object, soft or hard, hot or cold, must necessarily be distinguished as soft or hard, hot or cold, by one sense separately, that is, the touch. It is the sole province of another, the sight, to perceive the colors of things, and the several properties that belong to them. The taste has a distinct office. Odors particularly affect the smell, and sound the ears. And therefore it cannot be that one sense should correct another, nor can the same sense correct itself, since an equal credit ought to be given to each, and therefore whatever the senses at any time discover to us must be certain. And though reason is not able to assign a cause why an object that is really foursquare when near should appear round when seen at a distance, yet if we cannot explain this difficulty, it is better to give any solution, even a false one, than to deliver up all certainty out of our power, to break in upon our first principle of belief, and tear up all foundations upon which our life and security depend. For not only all reason must be overthrown, but life itself must be immediately extinguished, unless you give credit to your senses. These direct you to fly from a precipice and other evils of this sort which are to be avoided, and to pursue what tends to your security. All therefore is nothing more than an empty parade of words that can be offered against the certainty of sense. Lastly, as in a building, if the principal rule of the artificer be not true, if his line be not exact, or his level bare into the least to either side, everything must needs be wrong and crooked. The whole fabric must be ill-shaped, declining, hanging over, leaning, and irregular, so that some parts will seem ready to fall and tumble down, because the whole was at first disordered by false principles. So the reason of things must of necessity be wrong and false, which is founded upon a false representation of the senses.
Charles, thank you for reading that today. This is one of the most important passages I think we have attacked anywhere in the book, as a matter of fact. It's certainly one of the clearest on epistemological issues and conclusions that Epicurus drew. And a lot of the conversations that we have on the different forums that we participate in end up being related to the subjects that are discussed here. So I don't know if we'll be able to tackle it all today, but we will get started and start at the beginning of this passage. Let me repeat the first part of it so that we know what we're talking about right now. The first of it was the part about if anyone thinks he knows nothing, he cannot be sure he knows this when he confesses that he knows nothing at all. Now, what would someone like to say about that?
Well, I talked to my coworker about that last year, and he said that was nothing but a word game because he believed in it.
A word game because who believed in it? Your coworker or Epicurus?
My coworker.
Well, is it a word game? Is it a word game? That's what we should probably discuss. That would be a great thing to try to unwind. Elaine, is it a word game?
It is a little bit because it's confusing. It's like when people accuse certain types of atheists of having a religion. So if a person like me, I'm an atheist, I am just, I'm without God. I'm lacking that sensation of belief in anything supernatural. So the absence of a sense of knowledge is not the same as knowledge about something. It's a different experience. I mean, I think, when you believe something is not true, for me, it's a sensation that I'm describing, like a feeling of knowing that something is wrong. And if there's just an absence there of, this, I just don't have this belief, that is a different internal sensation. And it's a problem because we're having to use abstract language to describe it. So you can always get into a word game. So if a skeptic says, I don't have the sensation of knowing anything, I don't have a feeling of certainty about anything, then they'd agree with you that if you say, well, then how can you be certain that you don't know anything? Well, I don't have that. I'm lacking that feeling. I can report on that. So it's not this. Is that clear?
Well, I think, yes, as far as you go, I think somebody trying to defend the statement as written might say that what he's observing is that the statement of the skeptic is self-refuting or self-contradictory.
I know, but it's not. It's not. So he's reporting that he has no sensation of certainty about anything. That's a report of experience. So if you come back and say, well, how can you be certain that you don't know? You just say, I'm experiencing that I just don't have that sensation of knowing. It's not
on a stove.
Yeah, but that is an experience and not the same thing as a cognitive sense of certainty. So it's a limitation of the language that it's difficult to express that. So, but there's been some interesting. There's a book about certainty or knowing. I'll have to look that up. But there's a certain sensation that people can have when they just feel like they know something, and we usually associate it with content, like that it's about something. But there's actually been some weird research where they can stimulate part of the brain and give people the experience that they know something, but they don't have any content in it. So they're like, I know, I just feel certain. Well, about what? I don't know, but I know it, whatever it is. So I think there's a brain function that people are describing when they try to talk about this, but are not aware that there's actually a specific brain function that's doing that for them.
I was concerned we might not finish this series of passages today. We may not finish the first sentence today the way we're going, because I think we've already jumped into the middle of the problem or a problem. So let's turn to the expert in German logic and argument, Martin. What do you think, Martin? Let me ask this question, Martin. Is this sentence a valid and persuasive logical attack on skepticism, or is it a word game?
Yeah, I mean, if we interpret it the way Elaine did, it's perfectly fine. But we can also take it from the perspective that it's just a logic game. Eh? So that means we play around with statements where we have something, assume that one statement is somehow not knowingly to be knowable, to be absolutely true or false, and then logic gives immediately the result. Eh? And if we take it like this, it's just a word game. But if we interpret it the way that it's actually expressing an inner sensation, then it's of course not a word game. Then we talk about something what we can determine experimentally.
So can you flesh that
because
out a
it
little? Go
depends.
ahead,
It
Elaine.
depends on the definitions, right, Martin? I mean, I know some people that are skeptics who would totally agree. Yep, you're right. I can't be sure that I don't know anything. It wouldn't be a problem to them. It would totally fit with their skepticism rather than being an argument against it. They would say, yeah, I don't feel like we can know anything. And when you say, how can you know that you don't know anything? I'm like, yep, you got a point. I don't know that either. It's not
So
contradictory.
So, Elaine, it sounds like you're saying you do not consider such a person to be a trifler who perverts all things and who, like a tumbler with his head prone to the earth, can go no otherwise than backwards. You don't consider that position to be trifling.
No. I think it is just a person who constitutionally is more concerned by that tiny percentage of uncertainty. When you look at a picture, some people will pay more attention to the foreground and some people more to the background, and people who are constitutionally skeptics zone in on that teeny tiny little bit of uncertainty and can't think about anything else. I don't it's not really this argument makes sense to Epicurus and Lucretius, but it would not dissuade a skeptic, because a skeptic would be like, yeah, you're right, can't be certain about that either. And they're not trifling, that is just what concerns them.
You must have met one rude skeptic.
Oh heck, I live in Rocket City, USA. We have one of the highest concentrations of PhDs anywhere, and they're rocket scientists. And there are some real interesting thinkers around here. So they wouldn't have any problem with saying, yeah, you're right, I could be a brain in the vat. I can't know. I can't know. And they get real obsessed with that sometimes. And I just don't really care about that. I mean, like, I actually agree with them. We can't 100% know everything, but I just don't think it's relevant to my life.
Maybe that point right there, Elaine, is where I'm learning a lot in these discussions myself as you grow through them. And I think that's probably the takeaway point for me here, is that I have to keep in mind that there are certain people who just look at things differently like that, and they're not going to look at them the way I do. They're not going to come around to my point of view, and I'm not, and I'm not going to come around to theirs in the end either. It's we do have different types of people in the world who are concerned about different things.
And you're not going to persuade them with logic.
You're not going to persuade them with logic. You're not.
We have evidence on that point. There's actually experimental research in psychology demonstrating the lack of ability to persuade people out of a position with logic. You actually entrench their position. So this just won't work.
Now, I'm sure it comes through in my voice and what I'm saying that I'm thinking that Epicurus, who was living in Athens surrounded by a bunch of what I would consider almost pin-headed logicians, probably felt like he wanted to deal with the logical arguments, and that's why this is here as well. I'm not disagreeing with what you said, Elaine,
it's real tempting. It's real. So it does have the effect in arguments of preaching to the choir. So your side will be like, yeah, that's logical. Why don't they believe that? But it doesn't convince the people who have the contrary opinion. But it does build your team. You know, it does kind of preach to the choir.
Right. Well, and maybe we should touch on this point for just a minute. I think that the Epicurean team was big enough to encompass both sides of the position. Now, we're going to spend so much time for the rest of this passage talking about the role of sensation. In fact, that's the very next sentence and so forth. Yeah. But I do think that Epicurus, and we'll just leave this point alone and move forward, I think Epicurus is doing both. He's dealing both with the logical argument and grounding it in experience as well. I
want to point out this last phrase. What taught him to distinguish between doubt and uncertainty?
Absolutely.
So a full-going skeptic, somebody who's really thoroughly in that position, doesn't distinguish. It's kind of life as an experience of doubt. But it's real interesting for the rest of us. What is it that distinguishes? And I think the current neurology research is showing us that there's actually a brain function that does that. It's just that, to me, that gives you that sense of knowing. That's super fascinating.
We're going to have the same discussion then about this next sentence in the first passage as we did the first one. But let me repeat that one for just a second, because the rest of it is, and yet allow that he knows this. I would ask, since he had nothing before to lead him into such a knowledge, whence had he the notion what it was to know or not to know? What was it that gave him an idea of truth or falsehood? And what taught him to distinguish between doubt and certainty? Before we actually move to discussing the role of the senses in that, we probably ought to discuss just the context in which he's asking this question, because he seems to be presuming that there is a difference between truth and falsehood.
Some people, I think, can, at least skeptics, can point to their childhood when they had this. Some people time sequentially recall a sensation of knowing, and then as they started to think about things more, got so focused on uncertainty that they don't really experience certainty anymore, but they can remember the sensation and they can recognize it when other people talk about it. So that's one way.
You're equating knowledge with a sensation.
Well, that's how it is for me. I don't know how it, but like I when I feel like I know something well enough, I have an internal feeling, and there's neuroscience research to back up that this is something the brain does. So I'm making that up.
Let's talk about that before we go further. Martin, is knowledge a feeling?
I mean, we certainly have a feeling of whether we are sure about knowing something. For example, if we look at mathematics, which is built entirely on logic, so I consider this one as absolute truth with two caveats, and something to the opposite is then absolutely false. And when people did not yet separate this clearly from what is empirically known, then this leads to confusion, because whatever is empirically does not have this certainty of logic. So we have this chance that somehow things are completely different than we think. With trivial things, it's unlikely, but with non-trivial things, it may happen. And the feeling of whether we know something or not doesn't make this distinction. So if I go through a mathematical proof and I think it's correct, then I have this feeling, yes, I know this now, and I know even it's an absolute truth, but I also know it's completely irrelevant for reality. So, and things about reality are different. So they come in from the senses, and there then it's open to interpretation. And like mentioned, there are many cases where we don't have this level of absolute truth. We can have within pure logic, which is irrelevant to what's going with respect to telling what's going on in the world.
Well, Martin, I think I understand what you just said. Let me ask the question a different way. What taught you to distinguish between doubt and certainty? What is it that gives you the idea that there is something such as truth or falsehood? Is it a feeling?
Yeah, on a specific, if it's for a specific topic, I know this that I have this certainty. That is an inner feeling.
Yeah. So I found the book, in case any readers are interested. The title of the book is On Being Certain, subtitle Believing You're Right Even When You're Not, by Robert A. Burton, MD. And it has a summary of the neuroscience research into this sensation. A lot of people will call it a feeling. Could be a pleasurable feeling, this feeling of epiphany, of knowing. So I think it's a brain function, and I'm basing that on observations of reality. So it's different from the way Epicurus, I think, is presenting it here, but I don't think he would, being presented with research that supports it. I don't think that would be a problem for him to incorporate.
Charles, you haven't said too much yet. What do you think?
Well, kind of agreeing with Elaine.
On which point?
The book that she brought up, and also how it's not really contradictory or so different to the point where it could be incorporated, just about, the feeling and observations of other people and how they can begin to feel certainty.
Okay. Well, before we go further, let me be Pontius Pilate and ask, what is truth? We're talking about truth here. What is truth?
So let me read you an excerpt from this book. Despite how certainty feels, it is neither a conscious choice nor even a thought process. Certainty and similar states of knowing what we know arise out of involuntary brain mechanisms that, like love or anger, function independently of reason.
Independently of reason.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Now, I do think some people get a sensation of certainty from logic, and that can lead them in all kinds of crazy directions. My sense of sufficient certainty, I'm going to say, not absolute certainty, but sufficient, comes from looking at a lot of evidence. And so I'm sure I'm more like Epicurus than Platonist, because I want to see data. I want to see sense data. I want to see data that's from the extension of the senses. But I'm definitely going to, as we get into here, trust that is going to give me the sensation of knowing, to see a lot of evidence.
Elaine, when I hear you describing this, I'm hearing you define knowing something as having a sensation of certainty about something.
Yeah. And I think that's what the evidence really clearly says, Cassius. It's not vague. That is what the data supports. So if you're a person that goes with observations as providing truth, this is not something you can ignore. This neuroscience research, it's not subtle.
I certainly think that you're right, and you're describing sort of a physiological approach to what knowledge is, and I don't dispute that. I'm wondering if, is that sufficient? Is that a complete picture of what we should be talking about in reading a philosophy book? Or, Martin, are you comfortable that we are sufficiently describing what it means to know something? Remember, I'm sort of the facilitator of the conversation sometimes too, instead of just telling you my opinion. So go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I couldn't even tell now.
Okay, are we talking about knowledge as a general concept in itself? When you say it's a feeling, how do you relate your definition of the feeling to a particular thing that you know? Do you know something simply by having a feeling, or how do you?
Right. So for me, my feeling of certainty is from observations that are dependable, that can be replicated, where there's predictability, which all goes in with materialism. So I'm going to believe it's real and it's true if you can show me that it's consistent, that there's a mechanism. It's going to happen again tomorrow the same way, unless conditions change. That's going to be my criteria of whether it's accurate. So there's accuracy, dependability, reliability of observations. That is going to give me that sensation of knowing.
And I have to agree with that, especially the materialism part. If we can think of something as knowledge because of our certainty, then by our materialism, it would have to be something rooted in our physiology or our minds, something more physical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe in order to move the discussion along, I need to focus on asking the question again: what is truth? Most people will say that they know something is true. We've been discussing what it means to know something. What does it mean to know something is true? What is truth?
It's still caught up in that same sensation. Those words are not totally separate. So, but for me, what's true is what is observably is reliable. It's not, I can confirm it repeatedly with sensory observations, and I'm going to believe it's true.
Martin?
Yeah, it depends even on where. So if I see a truth table from logic, then I know, okay, what's written there with T, that is truth. No? So that is the obvious part. No? But how well that matches our world and where we live, that is irrelevant for that. No? And
like a logic problem is different from reality, right?
Yes, exactly.
Or like a math problem, yeah.
And you can construct things in logic that you get into contradictions, then that is an oddity. And with empirical things, you don't have this problem. No? So the data will then give with some more or less known probability what is considered to be the truth. And based on our assessment of this more often failed than actually accurately known percentage, we then develop this feeling, yes, we know this now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's exactly how I would, yeah, I agree.
Okay. Well, why don't we go forward into what we have as our second paragraph in material in front of us. And there's just a couple different aspects of it that let me go ahead and segment out. The first sentence of this next passage says, "But you will find that knowledge of truth is originally derived from the senses." Now, that's a statement that is immediately followed by a longer extension of the statement that nor can the senses be contradicted. There's a couple of sentences there that we're going to talk about that point out that the eyes can't correct the ears and so forth, but I'm not sure that that is quite as interesting a topic as just the general statement at the beginning that knowledge of the truth is originally derived from the senses. Do we all agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's how the human brain typically works, that whatever that function is that gives us that feeling of certainty has to act on sensory input. So yeah, I agree. We're not getting information from about the outside world any other way except senses and feelings and
Okay.
Yeah.
And I should have probably included this statement: for whatever is able by evidence of an opposite truth to convince the senses of falsehood must be something of greater certainty than they. With the ultimate point being that if you're going to say that something can contradict the senses, then you've got to have a greater certainty from that outside thing than the senses. And Epicurus is saying there is no such thing. What did you say, Charles?
You'd have to use your senses to get that, right? Oh, sorry, Charles, go ahead.
I think it was in book 3, or maybe the very beginning of book 4. No, I think it was in book 3, about how the greater presence of evidence over one thing must be met with its full acceptance.
I remember there's a couple statements like that, yes.
And that seems to be this, again, but worded differently.
The section that I remember was a statement, I think it's in book 1, to the effect that if you cannot be sure or certain about things that are directly in front of you, how can you be certain about anything? Which is not exactly the same point, but it's still kind of related, because knowing something that's directly in front of you is pretty obviously based on the senses of seeing it and touching it and holding it. And if you can't be certain about that, how can you be certain of anything?
Yeah, now he doesn't bring in religion here, but I would just like to mention it because, so there's a real interesting book called Fact versus Faith by Jerry Coyne that talks about the totally different tack that at least the Christian religion takes versus science. And scientists want observations, multiple observations before they're going to accept something as most likely accurate. But in religion, you get bigger points, bigger brownie points if you believe something not only in the total absence of sense evidence, but something that's contradicting sense evidence. And if you can have faith in that and trigger the sense of knowing from that direction, you get bigger religion brownie points.
Elaine, that's the point about I believe it because it's absurd, right? Didn't somebody say something like that?
Oh yeah, he said that. Yeah, you're right. I remember there's a quote about that from a theologian. Yeah. Yeah, so that this is the materialist point of view, but some religionists are going to say, you should ignore the senses in favor of belief.
Yeah, that's something good to bring up, because I was thinking to myself just reading over that first sentence, and if that knowledge didn't come from the senses and if it came from something outside, what we can assume that to be would be, faith.
Yeah. And what can be of greater certainty than the senses? A religionist wouldn't have any problem saying, yep, you're right. I have something that overrides all my senses. I have faith.
Either faith, but there's another avenue, which would be that you were born with this innate knowledge from when you were with God, and you're spending your life studying mathematics and the tools of logic so that you can be like Plato and know geometry and then become sort of like a priest of the absolute ideal which is not necessarily the same as religion, at least in every.
Well,
it ends up being close to it.
Pretty close.
Yeah, it's pretty damn close.
Boy, I don't want to leave that paragraph yet, but I want to make sure we don't miss the very last sentence in that paragraph that says, therefore, whatever the senses at any time discover to us must be certain. And that is one of the major criticisms that superficial people make of Epicurus, that he said all sensations are true, and people say, well, obviously they're not all true. Illusions happen all the time. Well, if you read Lucretius, you've just spent significant time laboriously going through a whole list of illusions that you have to deal with. So obviously Epicurus knew that illusions are part of life, and that the senses can report things that are distorted and that are not fully accurate to the full truth of a particular situation. But that doesn't mean that they're wrong. It's the judgment. Go ahead, Elaine.
Well, I do want to say where he has, can the ears correct the eyes, or that each sense is separate and each has its distinct powers. That's actually it's not quite neurobiologically correct. I mean, there are plenty of people like me. I have this lexico-emotional synesthesia, so I get sensory impressions from feelings and some words. But then there are other people who have different kinds of synesthesia where they see colors when they hear certain pitches. So in their brains, even if the eyes and the ears are separated physically, there's absolutely no way for them to experience their senses separately. It's not a stepwise process. They can't have that experience.
Not to mention the connection between odor and taste.
Yes, exactly. And during the coronavirus, we've all, I think, become very educated, whether having that experience ourselves or hearing it from other people, that when you lose your smell, you lose most of what you think of as taste. So this, he'd have to amend this a little bit. And people, even normal, I'll say typical people without overt synesthesia, there have been studies about how food will taste differently to them depending on what color plate it's put on or what color cup it's in. Even the temperature of the food will be subjectively perceived as different. So there's a lot more mixing up of the senses when we're perceiving them than Lucretius was aware of.
Maybe the comment to make at the moment would be to go back to the first sentence, whatever is able by evidence of an opposite truth to convince the senses of falsehood must be something of greater certainty than they. So right. Regardless of how the modern physiology may talk about the relations between different senses nowadays, what is of greater certainty than the senses, even under the latest scientific research? Is there anything that can produce greater certainty than the senses?
Not for a materialist.
Well, and to explain your meaning when you say that, go ahead and not for materialists.
Because certainty is a sensation. So religionists get a stronger sense of certainty based on really, of course, based on what they've been told since they were very, very young, that get in it, this believing this gives them a sense of belonging with their community. And so they have linked it with this neurological sense of certainty. And it's tight, man, it's tight. It's hard to disrupt that.
Well, now this is an interesting road you're going on right this second. You're saying that a person who believed in religion could in fact get a greater sense of certainty through their religion that can override the senses.
Yeah, well, that's what I observe. But because I'm a materialist, I'm observing this happen.
Well, so that points us back in the direction of how we have to clearly talk about our systems and our definitions and so forth, because while I would certainly agree with you that the emotional sense of certainty of a religious fanatic could be greater than the sense of certainty of Martin when he evaluates a equation in his engineering office, I would not grant myself that the religious fanatic is in fact more certain of a fact than is Martin.
Well, then you would need to point to what actually reinforces each feeling of certainty and what can be held up to scrutiny. Is there something behind the faith besides just an individual affirmation of it? or is there something actually behind it that is tangible and observable and repeatable?
Observable and repeatable. Okay, that's what I was going to say. I mean, so like there's two different things. Does a person's sense of certainty line up with observable, repeatable, predictable phenomena? And the only way that I know of to have your sense of certainty line up with observable, repeatable, predictable phenomena is to use your senses and not logic or faith. But if their goal is not, if they think that there's something different that's truth that doesn't have anything to do with observable, repeatable phenomena, they're just defining truth differently. And
Martin, I'm sorry, go ahead, finish it then, Martin.
Yeah, you can't, you'll be playing a word game if you make that argument, because they're defining the feeling that they're having is similar, but they're defining truth as having nothing to do with observable, repeatable, dependable phenomena.
Martin, come back in at this point. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there, but I have no comment.
I was thinking you might have a comment. Nobody's going to dispute that the feeling of certainty that a religious fanatic might have could easily and often will be stronger than the feeling of certainty of a scientist in a laboratory about something that he's experimenting on. And we as materialists, still, we're not going to rank our view of the certainty by the strength of the feeling, are we?
Well, that's what I wanted to talk about, how somebody who is very religious or spiritually minded, they might say, well, whenever I think about my faith, I get this confirmation, this feeling of certainty, and to them, it's very repeatable and predictable, and it's something they can observe within themselves. So they might want to they might want to disavow empirical evidence or even reasoning, if I'm going to use that word entirely.
Yeah.
Well, maybe somebody listening to the podcast right now might be thinking in response to what Elaine is saying, so are we going to just simply acknowledge that a religious fanatic can have a greater sense of certainty than a scientist or someone approaching it from a materialist or Epicurean point of view? And maybe we're going to say, yes, we all know that the confidence of a wild-eyed religious fanatic can hardly be exceeded by anybody who's acting reasonably. But how do we then assess the relative, shall I use the word correctness of the two positions, or how do we assess which of those paths of life is preferable, Elaine?
Well, because we want pleasure, the path that's preferable would be the one that results in being able to make the decisions which produce the most pleasure. And the evidence is that that's the materialist position. But for a religionist, they're going to say, well, you're not going to find out the rest of that till after you die, and I'm just not going to believe anything you say. I don't think this is going to convince them, but it certainly makes sense to me.
But Elaine, aren't we saying in this discussion today that you and your approach are still not going to end up with a greater sense of certainty than the religious fanatic?
Probably less certainty, but I might get more pleasure because they're waiting till after they die, and I'm not.
And your criteria for taking that position, your standard for saying that your conclusion is the correct one is what?
Yeah, I was not raised religious, so I think I agree with him, like that let's say the innate tendency of humans, if they haven't been taught to value faith and belief, that we evolved using our senses to find out about reality. And then these social memes, whatever you want to call them, developed, some people call it, the God virus, that have been a different kind of pathway for people to get that feeling of certainty, and especially within a group setting. But I think my raising was probably, just being raised without it, let me just learn to rely on my senses, on observations to trigger my sense of knowing something.
But also, Cassius, comparing, a scientist or somebody who's, swayed by evidence versus a fanatic, like a religious fanatic, the levels of certainty that they have in their beliefs doesn't invalidate or affirm one sense of truth over another, because one's going to be inconsistent.
How do you mean? How do you mean that being inconsistent?
Well, one side is going, if we're talking in this direct comparison between materialist or scientist and somebody who's moved by faith, one is going to be consistent with reality, and we can take what's repeatable and observable, but also backed up by, reality more than just a person's feeling of faith.
Where you're saying that you will choose you'll choose the red pill, as in the Matrix movie. You choose to know what reality really is. Is that what you're saying?
Well, one person's faith might have a stronger sense of certainty, but that wouldn't apply to their friends and family or people around them. Whereas things, say, happening around me, other people can also see, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Mark, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Just the feeling of faith is more individually, whereas more self-centric.
And our ultimate position is that these are decisions for the individual to make. Is that where you're going there?
Well, they do make, although I would say that faith to develop at all requires social pressure. It's not, I don't think people, well, I could be wrong about that. Maybe somebody just raised by wolf would make a religion. Maybe we do. Maybe that is a innate thing that we get into, but
no, but that is a good thing to factor in, like a supposed miracle being witnessed by 10 very religious people.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to go any further in the text today because we've already covered so much ground, and I'm not sure we've covered the ground nearly well enough in terms of depth or
there's so much in it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This is so important, a section. I will get this episode posted as quickly as I can and try to get comment and to allow others to post comments on one of the forums and see if anybody wants to ask questions or inject their own opinion that we can include in our discussion, because this could go in so many different directions. So let's not go any further with the text, but let's take as much time as we want to talk about any summary comments on what we've already discussed so far today.
Oh, I do want to just make one more little nerdy comment about the census being separate. In looking at this, it's almost like where he says, sound could particularly affect the ears and odor particularly affect the smell. That would, only be true if the sound was something, I don't know, because sound is sound waves. I mean, it's a vibration. Of course, it could affect our bodies through other means. So we know that we can all feel, like if you hear the bass on a loud radio in the car next to you, it makes your bones rattle, right? So you can feel sound as vibration. That's a kinesthetic, tactile kind of, vibration sense. We have vibration receptors. So if it's a real thing, there would be nothing to rule it out being able to affect other sensory organs. That wouldn't really even make sense that it would be restricted to one sensory organ. Why would that be? So, anyway, that's my nerdy comment.
I don't mean to say that this is my final comment, but I do want to put in the main section of our discussion today that we haven't even touched on the issue that this is written in a philosophical context in which other Greek philosophers had basically attacked and undercut the senses as being a reliable source of knowledge, and that Plato and Aristotle in particular had pointed to logic as the ultimate means of knowledge and had asserted that, in fact, you really could not consider something to be known unless you could, in fact, put it into a logical proposition or a logical syllogism or explained it logically, which I gather was one of the reasons that he put no one in here who doesn't know geometry. Elaine, what do you want to say there?
You said the word reliable, and so that is what I would focus on. The only way to get reliable information that I know of is to use the senses. So if reliability is what you need, if you want to know what's really out there in a reliable way, you can't use logic. You've got to use observations. So I think focusing on that aspect of I define what's true. It incorporates reliability that's really there means it's reliably there. And people who don't incorporate that into their definition of what's true that wouldn't bother them, but it sure bothers me. And so if you're going to, I think it's very clear we can prove that logic is not reliable as the census, as observations. It's not.
Any comment on that, Martin or Charles?
Not really, no.
Do y'all agree?
Yes.
Yeah.
My answer to that question would be that I would want to be very precise about when you use the word logic. I am personally not so sure that you should not use the word abstract logic in stating that sentence, because I think where Lucretius is going is that there is a logic and there's logic. And depending on how you define the word, I personally, maybe this is something I should say, I personally don't consider a religious fanatic who states to me some religious proposition, I don't consider any of that logical at all, because it doesn't have a grounding in reality, in my opinion. I know that there are types of logic that don't require a grounding in reality, and in fact assert that a grounding in reality is impossible or inferior. I personally use the term logic to imply that if it is logical, it is grounded in evidence of reality. I know that not everybody uses the word logic in the same way there. Or reasonable, for that matter, is another word I would use in a similar context. If something is reasonable, it, in my definition of the word reason, I think Lucretius uses the word true reason. In true reason, something to be reasonable or something to be logical has to be grounded in the evidence of the senses. So I think there's multiple definitions of some of these words.
That's not what most people mean when they say logic. So I see now what the problem with communication is. So
well, tell me what you think is the more dominant definition of the word logic.
So usually most people, I think, just like lay people, are going to use logic to mean that you can draw abstract conclusions, which are they're correct because they add up like a math problem. Is their sense of it.
That is a very close to the heart of our communication issues on what we're talking about, because I would not say that most people, I would have said that most people in my experience consider logic in a practical manner, that they presume logic means a subset of common sense. But I certainly agree with you, Elaine, that there are many people who use logic in exactly the way that you have just described it. But let's see what Martin.
Can I say one?
Go ahead.
Oh,
sure.
I was going to say that the definition that I'm reading here when I Google it is the branch of philosophy concerned with analyzing the patterns of reasoning by which a conclusion is properly drawn from a set of premises without reference to meaning or context. And so I disagree with that as a method for forming reliable conclusions about reality, because if once you subtract meaning and context, you are missing critical parts of reality, and then you start to get off on this chain of context and meaning-free logical chains of conclusions, and you've left reality way far behind in the dust, and then you try to put your conclusions back on reality, and they do not fit your observations.
Elaine, what about your definition? Go ahead, Mark.
That's why logic has nothing to do with our senses and with reality. Logic is independent of our reality. So if we mix this up, we just create confusion. So I completely disagree with Cassius on this point.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think it's how he's defining it, Martin. And but I would recommend, Cassius, that you drop that. I mean, it's your choice. But it's like I know a guy who insists on using the word religion to refer to sets of cultural practices and insists that belief is not part of it. And so he makes these statements on an agnostic website about, religion is this critical blah, blah, blah. What he's talking about is cultural practices, and he can make a case but he makes all the atheists mad because he's using the word differently. So I would recommend that you consider dropping that.
Let me respond to that. Why, at least at the moment, I cannot agree to that suggestion, and that is because you're not referring to the source of all knowledge, which is Star Trek, the original series. When I think of logic, I think of logic embodied in Mr. Spock. And Mr. Spock, as a logical man or Vulcan, was not really too much involved in playing with premises or syllogisms or dialectical reason. He was always attempting to follow reason, I thought, and to follow the evidence that was in front of him. So I'm thinking that the cultural context of today has a different definition of logic than you're using, but I'm certainly agree. I understand your point. Okay, Martin has weighed in, and I'm not asking for you to take sides, Charles, but I want you to give your perspective on that.
To use a modern or contemporary reference, the way I see what you're getting at, Cassius, is kind of how the facts and logic crowd uses the word logic.
I think Elaine is right from a technical point of view, and Martin would be right from a professional point of view, that when you go to college and you take a course in logic, you're going to be taking a course in all of these very technical issues of, like I say, syllogisms and induction and deduction and things like that. But I confess that my ongoing limitation in life is that I'm just a poor, barely getting by kind of a layman in the southeast of the United States. And my experience, the people I deal with down at the 7-Eleven and the local gas stations will use the word logic relatively frequently. And I don't think they look at it the same way.
They're using it the way I'm using it, though. So
you think they are?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And when I have conversations with them, so they see particularly logic as having nothing to do with real details, and they're right. So logic is broad and abstract, and it leaves out the nitty-gritty details and overlooks, exceptions. So they see it as discounting real world variables, and then they also see it as that's where Spock would usually go wrong. Plus, he would discount feelings as part of reality.
Yes. That's the distinction that I draw. I draw. But you are slandering the name of Mr. Spock to associate with him the idea that he was missing. He was dated.
Missing.
No. On feeling, you're right. I completely agree with your attack. It's not defamation to say that Spock was devoid of feeling, but in terms of his processing power, he was the most data-driven of the people on the original series.
You can't say that as long as he was ignoring feeling, because we get evidence of other people's feeling through our senses, and he was missing that.
Yes. Well, that's
you can apply logic to empirical data, but then it's no more purely logic. You just use logic as a tool to deal with empirical data, and that is a combination which is okay. But logic itself is separate, independent of reality.
Right.
I'm thinking that I'm agreeing with that. You guys are saying I'm not, but I'm thinking I'm in agreement with what Martin just said. Go ahead, Elaine.
There are so many multiple connotations of the word logic, but for almost everybody that I know, it includes, especially people who are that we might be trying to convince, it includes abstraction inevitably, and so you can't rely on it. It's not as reliable as observations.
Okay, Elaine. And so when you make that statement as to the word logic, would you make the very same statement about the word reason?
So I want, instead of the atheists having a day of reason, I want them to have a day of evidence, because reason is super tricky. It's full of pitfalls and mistakes. And so I would focus more on getting good evidence.
Martin, would you make the same statement about the word reason as you would about logic?
Yeah, for me, reason is somewhat softer. So In logic, you need to have statements which are absolutely true to come to new statements which are also absolutely true. But if you use reason, you don't need this, and you also don't have then this absoluteness in it. So you can reason can lead you in the wrong conclusion. So the empirical data you start with may be incorrect, and then what you get out doesn't match reality. But you still reasoned properly. And so if someone who does not really have is trained or doesn't really understand logic, he can still use reason in this sense properly, because it somehow mimics logic. But we need to be aware it does not have this absoluteness of logic.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's begin to draw today's discussion to a conclusion. It's been one of the best ones I think we've ever had, one of the most far-reaching and even important ones. So if we begin to come to a conclusion for the day, what would everyone like to say in closing?
Martin, go first.
Oh, I have nothing to conclude. I would just regurgitate something, so I'm fine.
Yeah, nothing I've already said.
Nothing you haven't already said?
What's the most important thing you think that we've said?
The stuff about certainty.
About that being a sensation?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that's important. And I'd also, to me, that as materialists, we value reliability of observations as telling us what's really going on. And so if you're a person who shares that preference for actually being able to predict what might happen next or get reliable information, then there's no better way to get that than by being a materialist and making sensory observations.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for the discussion for today. We'll come back to this next week because the remaining section of text that we had for today is going to go over these very same issues and talk about the implications of them. So we can think about what we've said during the coming week, and we'll post this to the podcasting locations. And if anybody has any comments or questions about anything we've said, please let us know and we'll try to include them in the next episode. So with that, we'll close for the day, and thanks everybody for your time.
All right.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Good week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.